Yes, I'm definitely a fair weather traveler. I was going to say, and then, Dan, your explanation of leading songs reminded me when I first started, leading songs, and this is a number of years ago, I would practice well in advance, make sure I really knew it. I wasn't like picking a song that I didn't know how to lead. But the problem came when I got a little bit more experience. And there's, several of the songs where the title is, there's two that are very similar titles and you're not as used to them. So I would pick them and then, Sabbath morning. And of course, I would kind of progressively get later and later in the Sabbath morning. I'd get, for a while I'd get up first thing, make sure I had lots of time to practice. And then after a bit, it was like, okay, 11:15, I'll just run through them really quickly. And then you're like, oh, I picked the wrong one. This is the one I don't know how to lead. And yeah, you're practicing to make sure it was all good. Going to give a message that I actually gave in Seattle a couple weeks ago, but hopefully it'll be better here because there are a couple things that as I gave that message that I still hadn't pieced together, and I'll probably talk kind of specifically and tell you the point. So hopefully you're getting the second and better version, maybe not, but we'll see. So as a kid, I love to read history in general. So loved all kinds of history, but in particular, I love to read about great sailors and great naval commanders. So people like Francis Drake, Columbus, Magellan, Raleigh, Cook. Love to read about the adventures that they took, the exploration that they did. And even great naval heroes like Lord Nelson or John Paul Jones, Oliver Hazard Perry, Matthew Perry, Stephen Decatur. I don't know if you know all of those, but Lord Nelson, of course, was a British commander, was instrumental in kind of containing and defeating Napoleon, and the Perry brothers and Decatur and John Paul Jones were great American naval commanders, particularly in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And then I love to read about the Greeks and the Romans and their triremes kind of sailing all over the Mediterranean. And of course, there's the Vikings, right, where they didn't just sail all over the Mediterranean. They basically sailed wherever they wanted, right? There was not much limit to what the Vikings can do. And of course, I'm sure we're all familiar with boats or the boats that they have, but you wouldn't imagine those could go all over the place. But man, did they sail all over. And just reading about their adventures on the sea fascinated me. How they would chart a course, how they would conquer oceans and seas. And we can look on, great explorers that explore the land, and there's some, solidness to land with oceans and with seas. They're ever changing, right? It's very almost by definition not solid. It's a liquid, and you never know what's going to happen. And even the great ships that they would sail, right? You had, of course, the triremes of the Greeks and the Romans, the longships of the Vikings. You had the frigates of the U.S. and England and Spain and Portugal. And of course, now what do we have? We have these massive floating seas, whether they be battleships and aircraft carriers, or even the large cruise ships that we have. I mean, they're just so big and massive today. And I'm sure, if most people have seen a movie where, it's about a ship, whether it's ancient or modern, in a storm struggling against these massive waves. So we have, pictures in our mind of what these great explorers would have to go through, because, one thing that if you're taking a long trip on the sea, most likely you're going to encounter some kind of storm along the way. And, from ancient time, people have been drawn to the sea. You can read stories after stories. Even with the great dangers that are in the sea, there was a lure of sailing for mankind. And at first the ships have to stay really close to the shore, right? They weren't able to really navigate great seas or oceans, but eventually sailors learned more advanced navigation, the stars, mariners' compasses, nautical charts, the spy glasses, I'm sure we're all familiar with from pirates. And even now, of course, binoculars and GPS and radar and all of these advancements that we have that sailors would use to to at least as much as they could control where they were going. And of course, when you think about a boat and what's important for a boat, there's the big parts that are important for navigation. There's a rudder, there's oars, there's sails, engines, anchors, right? And of course the helm, right, which is either a wheel or a tiller that the captain uses to steer the ship, making sure it goes where they want and doesn't, go where they don't, to make sure it doesn't run into rocks, or, if they can navigate around a storm, that's what they use. And of course, not all boats are huge, right? Some boats are very small. I never really had an opportunity to sail big boats, but I love to go canoeing. And I've been able to spend a lot of time canoeing. Growing up, we would go to the Boundary Waters. I was able to go to camp up there, SEP, a number of years and go on this week-long canoe trip. And most recently, I've been able to go on a couple of trips down the Missouri River in Montana. And I just love being out on the water. And, with a canoe, one of the first things that you learn is what? You learn different kind of strokes. And why do you need different kind of strokes? Well, you can, just have the normal stroke, and then you kind of go wherever the water takes you. But you learn different kind of strokes. So there's the J strokes, there's C strokes, there's prise and draws, there's reverse strokes, and you can also learn to kind of feather the paddle so that you can make the canoe go where you want it to go. And even in pretty rough water, you can if you're good, you can actually get it to go pretty straight, even if there's a lot of pushing and pulling to make you go in other places. And I don't know how many people have spent time in canoes, but you can quickly understand the idiom "up a creek without a paddle," because what do you not want to do? I mean, of course, you want the paddle because it can make you go forward, but more importantly, actually, you need the paddle because without the paddle, you don't know where you're going to go. It's just the waters will decide. Just this past summer, I was able to go with Hunter and Finn on a canoe trip down the Missouri River. We went with the Boy Scouts, and Hunter was the scout in charge, and they kind of get to choose a lot of things. And so one of the things they get to choose is who paddles together, right? We had two-person canoes. For some reason, he decided he and Finn were going to paddle together. It went really well in the morning. Both are pretty strong paddlers. And so it went really well, but it was very hot. It was about 100 degrees most of the time. It was after lunch. They had some brotherly loving communication earlier. And so we get out, we're heading out from lunch, and I was in a different canoe and not super close to him. I don't know what happened, but there was some tension there. And they were struggling mightily against each other. I'll just put it that way. And then eventually Finn, being the younger brother, got fairly tired of it and just stopped paddling. Hunter paddled for a while longer, and then he stopped paddling. And what happened about 2 minutes later? They hit the shore, right? Because when you're not paddling when you're not steering, the boat tends to go wherever it shouldn't go. And I use this just as to begin my message because, we often use sailing and being on boats or rivers or seas as a metaphor for life. And what's the one thing that you think about when you're sailing or canoeing or anything? You want to have control. You want that paddle in the water, making sure you're going where you want it to go. And of course, we can think easily or understand easily why sailing or being on the water is such a good metaphor for life, because there's lots of challenges, lots of things that we can't control. But, if we're sailing properly, if we have that paddle in the water, even in hard times, we can kind of make the boat go or our life go where we want it. We can steer through these events. And of course, from human reasoning, why would you not have, your paddle in the water? Why would you not be actively working against the rudder with the till to make it go where you want? But today I want to look at an interesting word in the Old Testament that might actually point us in a different direction. Because what if I told you up a creek without a paddle is sometimes what God wants us to do? So this word, it's if you want to, in your notes, if you want to put it down, jot it down, it's H8392, teva. And in both Greek and Hebrew, there's several words for ships, right? So this is, it's not like the Greek and the Hebrew is limited in the terminology. Just one example from the prophecy of Jacob to his sons in the book of Genesis. This is Genesis 49:13. It says, Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships. Now this word ships is not teva. This is H591, and it's a different word. So this is the word for ships. So it's talking about Zebulun, who will, basically be one of the sailing people of Israel. And there's two other Hebrew words and one other Greek word that's used throughout the Bible to mean ship. And none of them are teva. Teva, though, is different. In fact, it's only used in two stories in the Bible. These two stories, Noah and the flood, and the baby Moses being saved on the Nile. These are the only two places that it's used. And teva, the definition, means a box. A box. Now, what does a box not have? A box doesn't have any way to steer it. A box is something that, yes, can float, but can't be steered. You don't have a rudder on a box. You don't have easy way to put in paddles. And of course, we can think about it from Noah's Ark or what's more commonly talked about as the basket that Moses was put in. These were seaworthy vessels that had no way to steer them. Right? They were ships that couldn't be steered. They couldn't be controlled by human hands. They would go completely dependent upon where God would have them go. Right? God would be the one that would have to steer and direct the teva in order to make it go to safety. And in both of these stories, what is a big part of them? Salvation, being saved. Because what happened if Noah, his family and the animals crashed and the ark got destroyed? Mankind would be dead. All breathing, living things would be dead. Salvation of the entire human race and all things that breathed on the earth were in a box on the water that were completely unsteerable by human hands. Their safety depended entirely on God. And what about Moses? Moses' life was in God's hands, but what was God's plan for Moses? That he would save the Israelites. So in some ways, it wasn't just Moses' life, but the salvation of the people of Israel that were in the hands of this basket, right? This basket that was unsteerable, that was just put in the water. And I want to walk through these two stories thinking about it from this perspective, because I think, we can often read these stories and we know what happens at the end. Both of them worked out well. They worked out exactly as God has planned. But, I think if we can spend some time here, we can look and better understand what's really going on, because we can skip over them and just think, of course, the end was foregone, and it was because God was there. But to put yourself in this situation of locking yourself in a box that you couldn't steer, being upon the water, is pretty perilous. Again, this is why we have the idiom, up a creek without a paddle. It's something you don't want to do, because if you're up a creek without a paddle and you're not dependent on God, God's not there, guiding you to safety, chances are you're going to run into a rock, run into the shore. And again, I don't know how many of you have spent very much time in canoes, but one thing is, when you're not steering the canoe, it actually becomes very unstable. You start to twist and turn, and you can think of it odd because you're like, what's different between steering and not? Well, what happens is, when you're steering it, you're gliding through the water. The boat, the canoe is gliding through the water, but once you stop steering, the the boat just kind of goes with the waves, and guess where the waves are? Where the most pressure is, and where the most pressure, what does that potentially end up doing? Flipping you over. And especially if you're going, through maybe a rocky area or an area with a little bit of rapids, even not very much, you can turn over. Like one of the trips we were on, we were going through a fairly shallow part of the river, and we had spread out kind of far, and so one of the canoes was up pretty far, and so they stopped paddling to let everyone else catch up. Well, as they stop paddling, they kind of start, twisting and turning, and caught it just right on a rock, and it, tipped. Now, luckily, everything was strapped in, so it was, no big deal. People got a little wet, but this is what happens when you're on the water without steering. It becomes very unstable. So let's go through and look at these two stories and try not to just pass by and assume that the end happened, but from a physical perspective, what was going on? What were both Noah and then Moses' mother, what were they doing? Well, what was the faith that they were putting in God? So if you want to turn to Genesis, we'll read about Noah first. Turn to Genesis 6:13. It says, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." And then he says in verse 14, "Make yourself an ark." Again, if you think about what that word ark means, God says, make yourself a box. Now, I'm sure he explained to Noah what was going on, and I'm sure, Noah, if he had any seafaring experience, this is like, God, do you really want me to make a box? Like, shouldn't I make a ship, right? There was a word for ship, and God could have said, make a ship. But no, God said, make a box. And it goes on, it says, of gopher wood, and make rooms in the ark, again, the box, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, and its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Now, and I don't know how accurate this was, but I went online as I was reading through this, and there's some good pictures about how big they think the ark is. And the interesting thing is the ark, if we understand it properly, was probably one of the largest ever wooden vessels. And it's only once we started building ships out of metal that they actually became larger. And at least one thing I read, and this is the internet, so I didn't spend a lot of time, but it was interesting, is that they said they've done some math and calculations, and that this would have been about the biggest size wooden vessel that could be made stable on the ocean. So I thought that was an interesting thing. But basically here is this very large box that God told Noah to make. And again, if you think about it, Noah had a long time as he was building this box to think through, like, if there's a big flood coming, don't I want some control? Like, do I really want to lock myself in and not have any control? Because what happens when a big ship with lots of momentum hits something like a rock or a mountaintop? Not good. We all know what happened to the Titanic, right? It hit an iceberg and it was sliced through. And this was a ship that was designed to withstand hitting something. So what would the ark have? What would have happened to the ark if it hit one of the mountaintops as the water starts to recede? It likely would have been ripped open, and again, all of mankind would have been destroyed. But Noah, of course, did what God said to do, and this is one thing as I go through. You can take this as, well, we lock ourselves in a box and God's just going to take care of it, right? We don't have to do anything. But if you notice through the story, Noah does quite a bit. He builds an ark, for one. It's not a small undertaking. And we'll see some other things that Noah has to do. And so this isn't about God doing everything for you, but this is about God being in control and you giving up control. This is about Noah giving up complete control. He had no way to make sure the ark would land safely. He had no way to make sure that he and his family and the breathing animals that were with them would come through this great journey safely. They were completely dependent upon God. And they had that faith. He had that faith and confidence that God would land them safely. So it goes on, if we drop down, it says, now the flood was on the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. Now, again, let's pause and let's think through what's happening here. So he builds an ark, probably on the land, and then it starts to rain, and the water gets higher and higher and higher. Now, what happens with water when there's a lot of water coming down? We just had a lot of rain, and thanks to the snow that I didn't drive through, we have a stream going through our property, and that stream got really high. But what also happened to that stream? It got really fast and really choppy. So here, Noah is in this ark that was built on the ground with lots of rocks and trees and other things around it, and the water's rising rapidly. This wasn't, kind of the bathtub gently filling up. This was a lot of waves and wind and rain coming down, and there's mountains and there's trees. There's all kinds of dangers around, right? And Noah is sitting in this ark and has no control. He might see that mountain right ahead and he can't do anything about it. Yet he put himself in this situation. It goes on and says, the water prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the water, right? So it wasn't just sitting there. It wasn't, just kind of in one place, nice and gentle. No, it's moving on the stormy sea. And then it goes on and says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole earth were covered. And the water prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Now again, think about how water works. When there are hidden dangers underwater, right, what starts to happen? The water will get choppy, will get stormy, and will kind of suck you towards those hidden underwater dangers. And it goes on, it says, all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man. So there was only Noah. There was only Noah and his family and the animals there. So again, the entire safety, the entire life of mankind was in this one box that man had no control over, that Noah had given up control of because of how he had built it. Of course, obeying God, but how he had built it. Only God could make this happen. And this isn't just, again, we can read through this and just think, of course God would make it happen. And that's true. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion. If God's hand hadn't actively been there, that ark would have been destroyed. Probably a dozen times as we're going through this rising of the water, then these winds that we're about to read on, then the lowering of the water. These are dangerous things. These are times where even experienced sailors, when they hear about rising water, when they hear about high winds, waters that are receding quickly, they'll just not sail because these are dangerous times. Yet this is exactly when Noah locked himself into a box with no control. And it goes on, it says, only Noah and those who were with him remained alive. And then dropping down to verse 24, it says, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So he said, Noah is here for all this time, locked in this box with no control over where it's going. And this is a long time. A boat can travel a lot of distance in this time. And so he could have been over the Himalayas. He could have been over the Rocky Mountains, anything in this period of time. The boat, the box that he was in could have been in a very dangerous, precarious situation. And this is, if you think about Noah at this time, we can understand what the psalmist says, I put my trust in the Lord God, right? Because this is what Noah did. He put his trust in the Lord God. This is in Psalm 73, 26. It says, my flesh and my heart fail, Again, we can know the end of the story and not think about what was going on with Noah and his family. Do you think there were times where Noah's heart failed through all of this? That it was so stormy, so so likely that something would happen and this box would be destroyed. Do you think his heart failed? That he had to put his complete faith in God. And as I said, if it wasn't dangerous enough, we continue on, and it says the Lord or the God remembered Noah and every living thing. And then it says, and God made the wind pass over the earth and the water subside. Again, as I said, if you've spent much time on the water, when the winds come and the water starts to subside, it gets very choppy. It starts to move very fast. And especially if you have a lot of things that are underneath you, rocks or trees or limbs or whatnot, it can get very dangerous. Like these are times where even experienced or maybe especially experienced sailors will just stay off the water because they know how great the danger is. But this is what God took Noah through. And again, Noah could have been up there on the ark, looking out the window, see a mountaintop and, up ahead, and he could do nothing about it. If it was going to hit, it was going to hit. He had to put his full faith and confidence in God. And so it goes on, and it says, and the waters receded continually from the earth, and at the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, and the 17th day of the month, and on the mountains of Arafat. Now, does a boat just generally rest on a mountain? Again, if you've been in the water and you're coming up against rocks and stones as the water is coming down, do you generally just kind of gently glide and rest? No, it's not what happens. And so we can read this and just say, yeah, the ark just rested. It was nice and gentle. Waters kind of came down and God had it just in the right place. And maybe that's what happened, but it's not guaranteed. And it's not only is it not guaranteed, it's very unlikely that's what would happen without God being there. So we think about this box, this ark that Noah built. He built it without a way to steer it by human hands. But what did he have? He had full faith and confidence that God would steer it. That God, so it was this invisible rudder that Noah couldn't see, he knew was there. He knew was there. Again, as I said, the chances of this without God just happening are minuscule. But with God, of course, all things are possible. And now let's drop down to Genesis 8, verse 15 and 16. And this is one of the first things that I didn't have in my message before. But it's interesting because I kept messing it up. And I couldn't understand why I was messing it up. And you'll understand what I'm saying in a second, which made me keep thinking about it. And then I think there's a profound point here that if you understand this language, what it's saying. So it says, this is Genesis 8:15. So this is at the end of the story. It says, then God spoke to Noah saying, go out of the ark. So this is the end of the story, go out into the ark. Well, if you read back the beginning of the story, Genesis 7:1, it says, then the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark. And I kept getting this mixed up because I would say you would go into the ark and come out of the ark, right? You would go into the ark and come out of the ark. But what is this telling us? And these are exact Hebrew words. So it's not even like this is the English kind of covering it. Well, if you say go out of the ark, to go out and come into the ark, where does that put the person who's speaking? Inside the ark. Right? If you say, come into the ark, what are you saying? Come to me. And if you say, go out, you say, go out from me. So where does this put God? This puts God in the ark with Noah. Think how profound that is. That God is saying, I am inside this ark with you. Whatever happens to you happens to me. Is God going to let that ark be destroyed if he's in the ark? And where's that being steered? Is it being steered some external force, or is God in the ark, steering the ark? That's a profound thing, especially if we think about this notion of our lives being, this metaphor of being on the sea or in the ocean. What it's saying is God is in with us, right? He's willing to get his hands dirty. He's willing to be there with us, making sure that it's not just some abstract external force, but he's actually there with us in these situations, guiding and steering us, that what happens to us happens to him. If you think about this even more, think about like a mechanic. If they're going to work on something, if they're going to work on an engine, what do they have to do? They have to get in that engine. They have to get their hands dirty. They have to get under the hood. They have to get under the car. They have to get up into it, right? They're just not going to fix things. They're not going to make things happen externally. And this is what the story of Noah says. It says God was in the ark with him, right? And he was in at the beginning. So who, presumably in this story was the first one in the ark? Not Noah, not the animals, not Noah's family. It was God, because he said, come in to me. And then who was the last one to leave? God, because he said, go out from me. When Paul reminds us of the Lord's words, I'll never leave you nor forsake you, this is at the heart of it. God is saying, I'm in here with you. I'm going to be in here before you are, and then I'm going to make sure you get out safely before I leave. That's a profound understanding of how God works with us. That he's going to be in there before we have to be. He's going to take us through the dangers. He's going to take us through the challenges. He's going to take us through everything that life can throw at us. And then he's going to make sure we leave safely before he leaves. That's our God. That's how our God works. Right? He makes sure it happens from beginning to the end. He's there before us, and he turns the lights off, so to speak. He's not one that kind of just comes in, when it's nice and easy. And he's not a fair weather God. He was probably here when it was snowing, even though I wasn't. But this is the kind of God we have. And throughout our lives, even in those times where he commands us to step out in faith, or into something that's not fully in our control, he's there. It reminds me of the poem where it's, God and the person walking along, and sometimes there's two footsteps, sometimes they're one, and then the person asks, well, why did you forsake me at this time? And he said, no, you misunderstood. Those are my footsteps because I had to carry you. But it's the same notion. Right? God is there. God is making it happen. And sometimes he tells us to get into this box that we can't control where it goes. Again, this isn't about us not doing anything, because Noah had to get into the box. He had to go out of the box. He had to build the box. But there's a point in time where he had to let God control what was going to happen. And when was that time? It was the most dangerous time. It was when the most bad things could happen. He had to let go. He had to give the control to God. He had to let God decide what would happen. Paul goes on and says, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Right? And of course, it's not just man that can do things to us, right? It's life. All kinds of things. All kinds of things. And of course, we have the two great enemies, Satan and death, right? But and even more, we have mankind. We have nature. We have all of these things that can then happen to us, but God's in it with us, right? Even when we don't have control, God is there guiding and steering, and he's going to make sure we get there to safety before he steps out, right? He's the first to get in and the last to leave. It says, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Right? He works in you. He's in there before you even know he is. And he's going to be there to the very end, making sure he gets you to safety. It's a profound message that's in this story of Noah. And we'll go on and see the story of Moses as well. And then just dropping down to finish out in Genesis 8:18, God told Moses to go out. And so what did Noah do? It says, so Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Because what was Noah? Noah was a righteous man who obeyed God. He put his faith in God. He knew that God would take him through this trial and take him to safety. But again, you both give up control, but you have to do things. It's this balance, right? Sometimes God tells us to do something and we have to go do it. And then sometimes God says, just stop. Let me make it happen. Right? And this is why we need to be connected to God, why we have to understand God's will in our life. Because often what will we do? When God says, stand still, we'll try to go make something happen. And then we'll stand still when God says, you should go make something happen. Right? So we have to be connected to God. We have to understand. But this is a principle that we need to know first so that we can enact it in our lives. That there are times where we have to get into this box where we have no control, where we can't guarantee our own safety. But we know that God is in there with us, that God is the one that will guide us. God is the one that will land us gently on the mountain when it's against incredible odds. The other story that I mentioned that includes an ark is the story of Moses. And we know the story of Moses well. And as I said, this is at the very beginning of Moses' life. And so you can imagine how different things would have turned out. Now, if Moses would have died for some reason, God had an alternate, could have done an alternate plan, but God had a plan and he made that plan happen against, again, from human reasoning, something that doesn't make sense. So we start in Exodus 2, verse 1. It says, and a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, and this is a side point here because I found this very interesting. This word beautiful is the same word that God uses to describe creation in Genesis. So the same word where God said his creation was good after a number of the days, it's the same word that he's using here for Moses. So basically this is, God saying with the birth of Moses, here was this good creation, one that he was well pleased in, right? Because he knew what would happen in Moses' life. Now, what would have happened if the basket wouldn't have worked out, if Moses would have died in the basket? And we'll go on and talk about some of the ways that could have happened. That would have been a pretty short, good creation. But no, God had the end in mind. God knew what would happen throughout Moses' life. Not every detail. Of course, we all have our own will and we can fight against God. But God knew as he worked through Moses' life what would happen. And what would happen through Moses' life? The salvation of the children of Israel. Right? And so this good thing, yes, it was Moses himself was a good creation, but he also knew what would happen because of Moses, that the children of Israel would be saved. And what a good thing that was. And so it drops down in Exodus 2, verse 3. It says, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark. And this is, again, the same word ark that you use for Noah's ark. And it means a box. And again, we might think of a basket. I'm sure we've all seen the 10 Commandments. So we can imagine or picture what it was. This is an ark of bulrushes form, dabbed it in asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. So she made a seaworthy vessel that had no ability to decide where it was going to go. Now, of course, Moses was a baby. He probably wasn't able to steer the boat, even if there was, a rudder or a paddle or whatnot. But basically, Moses' mother builds this basket for him, puts him in the river, not knowing exactly what would happen. Now, from her perspective, you can understand why she would do it. Because what was guaranteed if she kept Moses? He was guaranteed to be killed. So she said, do I take a chance that he might live somehow, or do I guarantee he's killed? But she does it in a way where, again, she's wholly dependent on God to lead him to safety. because the likelihood that he would be safe, that he would survive this, was very low. And again, this is where something like the Ten Commandments can be good or bad. Because, we see the Ten Commandments and it looks pretty guaranteed, right? Like, it was pretty straightforward. Puts it in the reeds, kind of floats down. Pharaoh's daughter was there, saw it. Her servants go out, get it. Everything is good. But let's think about what really would happen. So let's read on a little bit further. Exodus 2, verse 4. And the other thing, of course, that we see in, which we'll talk about right here, is that who is there? Miriam. So, if anything bad happened, Miriam could go and get the basket, right? That'd be worst case. But let's start here in Exodus 2, verse 4 and see what it says. Because it says, and his sister stood afar off. Does it say in order to save him if something dangerous happens to him or something bad happens to him? No, it says to know what would be done to him. Miriam wasn't there. The first thing, Miriam wasn't there to protect Moses. Miriam was only there to see what happened. Because Moses' mother didn't know what would happen. And again, you think about the Nile River, it's a big river. Would you really want your daughter to go into this big river to try to save a basket? Because what would likely happen? She would now have 2 dead children. Right? So Miriam was only there to see what would happen. And it goes on and it says, and the daughters of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. So what does this mean? When they put the basket in the river, the daughters of Pharaoh, or the daughter of Pharaoh and her servants, weren't there. She put it in the reeds. She had Miriam watch what would happen. And then the daughters of Pharaoh came down. Now, I'm sure she probably knew, rough timing and, all of these things. And it was a well laid out plan. And, there's a lot of thoughtfulness to increase the likelihood of success. But, what if that day, the daughter of Pharaoh had not been feeling well or had gotten an invite to go somewhere else? Moses' mom wouldn't have known any of that. She probably wasn't that connected to the daughter of Pharaoh. No, she did as much as she could to make it succeed, but it was ultimately in God's hands. And even as it's written, you can see that this is what Moses, as the writer, is saying. He's saying, my mom put me in this basket. She knew I would die if she didn't. But she didn't know that I would survive if she did. It was just a higher likelihood of happening. And she, as I said, probably put a lot of plans, a lot of thoughtfulness into when to put the basket in, making sure the basket's seaworthy, where to put it in, all of these kind of things. But there was no guarantee of success. And in fact, I would argue that without God, the likelihood of success was pretty low. Because what is the Nile River? And I was reading some of this. The Nile River is one of the most dangerous rivers in the world. So it's very large. The currents can be very strong. There's crocodiles, there's hippopotamuses, there's venomous snakes. Where do venomous snakes like to hide out? In the reeds. Right? So where do hippopotamuses like to hide out? In the reeds. And we don't know exactly where she put in Moses, but where were the Israelites at the time? The land of Goshen. Where is the land of Goshen? The northern part of Egypt. Well, what is just north of the land of Egypt? The Mediterranean Sea. So what would have happened if she put Moses in this basket and the venomous snakes didn't get him, the crocodiles didn't get him, the hippopotamuses didn't get him, but it happened to hit the wrong current? This basket probably would still be floating around somewhere in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic or maybe the Pacific by now, because the basket was seaworthy, but Moses wouldn't have survived. So the chances of Moses' survival were very low without, of course, God. Right? This was an unsteerable basket that Moses' mother was the one who had faith that God would enable Moses' survival, that God's hand would be there. And again, we can read this, and in some ways this is, I love the Ten Commandments. I've watched it many, many times. But this is where something like the Ten Commandments can be bad, because it can just make it seem so easy. But it wasn't. It wasn't guaranteed. The likelihood was that Moses would have died. But Moses' mother had the faith in God that God's hand would be at work, that God would decide what would happen with Moses. And of course, we know the story, right? Moses, God decided, no, Moses isn't going to die. Against all these odds, I'm going to land him in Pharaoh's house, that he's going to get all the training, and then he's eventually going to go off and spend 40 years in the wilderness and then come back and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt, and then cross the Red Sea and then spend 40 years wandering, right? That's what God had in mind, and so he made it happen. And so it seems very easy, but it seems very easy because God's hand was there. God was the one that was steering that box. God's hand was the one making it happen. Now, we might say these are old stories, and stories that God specifically organized to bring about his plan, right? God's hand was very actively part of this. And you'd be right, because these were major turning points in the history of mankind. Think if Noah would have gone differently. Think if the story of Moses would have gone differently. God's plan, he could have worked it out. He might have had alternates, but he had a plan and he made it happen. So why is it important to us, right? Does God work this actively in our lives? Does this metaphor of our lives being this box upon the sea that God is steering, does it even make sense, right? Maybe God says, yeah, I'm there on the really important ones, but, CJ, you're not that important. I have lots of children. Sometimes I joke poorly on this, so this is my bad joke, but it's sometimes people will say, we'll get talking. I'm like, yeah, as long as I bring back 3 out of 4, it's good. I have 3 others, right? And I'm totally joking. But God could say that. I have billions of other children. If it doesn't work out in your life, not that important. Not worth me getting in the box with you. Not worth me personally steering and guiding you to safety. But that's not true, is it? It's not true. We know that's not true, that your life, your individual life, each and every one of us, is a key part of God's plan. Your life is as important as the story of Noah for God to fulfill his plan. He created you uniquely, right? And he's fitting you, it says, as living stones are being built up to a spiritual house. Right? He has a design for a house, and if you're not there, his house isn't how he designed it. Now, I don't know how many of you have built a house, but when you build a house, when you put in plans, you don't want to change it, do you? You built it, you designed it a particular way. And you'll do a lot to make sure that happens. It happens, on time, within budget, high quality. Do you think God's any different? If he's designing a house and you're part of that house, do you think he's just gonna let it go? Say, it's not very important. I can do an alternate plan. No, as we saw, maybe he could have had to do alternate plans, but he's choosing to do a plan. And that plan includes you, includes me, includes each and every one of us. And for that plan to work, he has to guide you to safety. Because we know the default is not that we're going to be guided to safety. The message, the sermonette about human nature, I was going to laugh. I was like, maybe I'm not going to give a message, because if we're talking about all that's wrong with human nature, especially of my human nature, it's going to take a lot longer than a sermonette time to cover it, right? Because by default, we're not going to go through safely in life and end up part of God's house. God has to be there, guiding, directing, steering us. The next one, and this is the second point that I thought about after the last time I gave this message, and this might just be happenstance, but it's an interesting happenstance, and I'll spend just a bit of time on it. Because, if you think about an ark in the Old Testament, what do you think about? I think about 3 things. Noah's Ark, That's probably the first one. You might not have thought about Moses' ark. I probably would have thought more of it a basket, but Moses' ark. And then what's the third one? The Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant. Well, the interesting thing is that in the Hebrew, the word for ark and Ark of the Covenant is different than for Noah's Ark and Moses' Ark, but it still means a box. So you basically have two Hebrew words that mean a box. One that's talking about this box that physically saved Noah, physically saved Moses, and then this Ark of the Covenant, the spiritual box that God himself would come down to, would sit on top of, right? This is very important spiritual box. Now, the interesting thing, though, is when we get to the Greek, where we get to the New Testament, guess what? Guess how many words there are for ark? One. Now, Moses' ark isn't talked about in the New Testament, but Noah's ark is, and the Ark of the Covenant are. And it's now been combined in one one word that means box. And again, this might be happenstance, but I thought it was very interesting because what do we get in the Old Testament? And we know it's not accurate, but lots of people think differently between physical salvation and the spiritual salvation. And even today, Old Testament, well, that's the physical nature of things, the physical law, all about physically saving Israel. And then there was this other spiritual thing, the Ark of the Covenant, God performing things, but they don't really seem to mesh. They don't seem to go together. They seem as two separate things. But what do we know? What does God or Christ make plain when he comes back in the New Testament? That there's not this separation between the physical and the spiritual. That the things that God is working out in the physical all are for spiritual reasons. Right? Noah's physical salvation wasn't so that mankind could physically be saved, was it? What was Noah's physical salvation for? So that God could bring more sons and daughters into his eternal spiritual family. What was Israel being brought out of Egypt for? Just their physical salvation so they could become this great physical nation? No. It was part of God's spiritual plan to eventually bring all of mankind into his spiritual family. And I just thought it was very interesting that you have this language difference that almost matches with how we think about the Old Testament and the New Testament. But that, in this box, in this thing that is all about salvation, that God in the Old Testament and the Hebrew let them think about it as two separate things, but then makes clear that it's the same thing, that it's really the same word in the New Testament. And again, this might just be happenstance, but I think it's very interesting, very profound, because again, it shows us that these things that we think are separate, are two different things, God brings together as one eternal plan in the New Testament. And again, that was always his plan. But what does it say? Christ had to come and tell these things, right? Because what did the Jews at the time think? They thought the Messiah was going to come back and set up a physical kingdom. Well, what does Christ tell us? He's going to come back and set up a physical kingdom and a spiritual kingdom, that those are one and the same. They're one and the same. And so we see God time and time again telling us not to worry, telling us not to worry physically, telling us not to worry spiritually, that he's there. He's there in this box. That's really the same thing, guiding and directing, steering our lives, right? Just like the Ark of Noah, just like the Ark of Moses, these vessels that have no way, seemingly by human hands, to be steered, to be directed, they in reality have the surest hands guiding and directing them, because God is there. God is in that box with us. He's in your box. He's in my box. They're with us, guiding and directing us. It's his hand that's on the rudder and the tiller that we can't see. And we don't know exactly where it's going to go. And we can look out and think, wow, there's danger ahead. But that's just God guiding where he wants it to go. And he's, as in the case of the ark, he's, even if there's a mountain ahead that it looks like we're going to run into, he'll make sure we gently land. Something that seems impossible, but he'll make sure it just gently land. David says of God that he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Right? He is there leading and guiding us. He's in it with us. It's not just some abstract force that's kind of nudging us a certain way. No, God is in the trenches with us. He's making it happen. And then sometimes, as in the poem, he's there actually carrying us, that we're not, even if we think we're doing something, we're not doing anything, that God is the one that's really making it happen. We have the surest hands guiding and directing our lives. We can't see it, but it's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. This is the story of Tevah. This is the story of Noah, the story of Moses, that sometimes we have to get in and we have to let go of control and know that God is there. God is there guiding and directing us. He's our loving Father. He wants us to end where? In safety. What's the ultimate place of safety? Is it some physical place that the church will go for 3.5 years? Not to downplay it, but no. The ultimate place of safety is where? In his kingdom. There is no death. There is no Satan. There is no tears. There's nothing but God's glory in his kingdom. If I had to choose a place of safety, that's where I want it to be. That's where I want to be, because that's where you'll be safe, not just for 3.5 years, not for, time and a half, but for all eternity. And that's where God is guiding and directing us. And so when we get into our own ark, as it says, God says, come into your ark and go on a journey. We have to do our part. Sometimes we have to build the box. We have to make sure it's seaworthy. We have to go in when God tells us to go in. We have to come out when God tells us to come out. So it's not that we don't have to do our part, but we have to have faith and confidence that God is there steering and guiding us, even when it seems like we have no control. Because sometimes it's best to give up control. To lock yourself in a box where you have no control, and the only thing that you can do is depend on God to put you where he wants you to be. When you think about it, what does God say if we are to seek the kingdom of God? It says we can only enter by what? A narrow gate. A narrow gate. Extending this metaphor, if you're trying to guide a ship into a very narrow strait, what do you want? You want somebody that's very good at steering a ship. As I said, I've spent a lot of time in canoes, but there's been some tough spots that, I bang up against the shore back and forth trying to get through a narrow spot. And so God is saying, if we're going to enter the kingdom of God, we're going to have a narrow gate with which to go through. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. If you have rough, stormy seas and you're trying to guide a boat in to a very narrow channel, who do you want steering that boat? Do you want to steer that boat? I don't want to steer that boat. Who would you want to have steer that boat? God. God. And as the examples we've read, sometimes God says, I don't want you to build a boat. I don't want you even to have the ability to steer, because you might mess it up. Just go with the box and let me do my thing. Let me guide you. Let me direct you. Right? It takes great skill to bring a boat through a narrow gate, especially in rough, stormy water. And it's a skill none of us have, right? David didn't have it. Abraham didn't have it. Noah didn't have it. Paul didn't have it. Peter didn't have it. Moses didn't have it. We can go through every one of the great men and women of the Bible, and none of them had the ability to steer their way through rough waters with a narrow gate. But what did they do? They let God do it for them. And these are men and women that are going to be in the kingdom. God says they're already there. They've not spiritually been put there yet, but it's a foregone conclusion. It's only the hand of God that can guide us through the narrow, difficult way that leads to the kingdom, leads to eternal life. John, in his vision on Patmos, as he's standing before Christ in his full glory, fell at Christ's feet. And it says, but he being Christ, laid his right hand on me. Again, what do you have to do to steer something? You have to lay your hand on it. You have to move it. And this is what Christ is saying. He says, he laid his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first, I am the last. I entered the ark first. I will leave it last. I'm the beginning and the end. I'll take you at the start of the journey, and I'll finish that journey. It's a powerful statement where he's saying, I'm putting my right hand, my strong, my dominant hand on you to make sure you go where I want you to go. You don't have to worry. You don't have to try to force your way through. I'm there. I'll make it happen. I'm the first. I'm the last. Christ started our journey. He's going to finish it. His hand, his mighty right hand is there upon us, guiding us, steering our life. And while to man having a ship without a rudder is nonsense, makes no sense. These might have been the only two boats in the whole of history that had no way to steer them. With God, putting our faith in him, this is how we can get to salvation. This is how he can lead us through the narrow gate to bring us, as it says, his good pleasure into eternity, into his kingdom.